A mighty empire's final breath was drawn not in a single moment, but over a century of conspiracy and conflict. The dramatic fall of Constantinople in 1453 is the epic conclusion to the Byzantine Empire's long decline, a story filled with palace intrigue, desperate wars, and a heartbreaking struggle for survival. By the end of this journey, you will understand the true human cost of an empire's collapse and the timeless forces that can bring even the greatest civilizations to their knees. What internal betrayals sealed its fate, and could a last-minute alliance with the West have changed everything? What does the fall of a city 1,000 years ago tell us about the world we live in today? The empire's throne in the mid-14th century was less a seat of power and more a center of crisis. Emperor John V Palaiologos inherited a crown that was financially and politically bankrupt. The treasury was empty, drained by payments to former allies and relentless enemies. The empire's territory was no longer a contiguous domain, but a scattered collection of cities, islands, and outposts, severed from one another by land and sea. To the west, the rising Serbian Empire under Stefan Dusan posed a direct threat, while in the east, the Ottoman Turks were consolidating their power with alarming speed. The Byzantine state was caught in a vise, and its survival hinged on a desperate and often humiliating strategy of playing its adversaries against each other. This was not an empire planning for conquest, but one simply struggling to exist from one year to the next. The Black Death had swept through its remaining lands a few years prior, decimating the population and shattering what was left of its economic foundation. Fields lay fallow, trade routes faltered, and the great city of Constantinople itself felt increasingly hollow, its magnificent palaces and churches standing as silent monuments to a faded golden age. How does a civilization navigate such a profound loss of power? The answer lies not in grand armies, but in the subtle, often treacherous art of diplomacy. Emperor John V spent much of his reign as a virtual supplicant, traveling to the courts of both Venice and Rome, not to forge alliances as an equal, but to plead for financial aid and military support. He was even arrested for debt in Venice, a stunning indignity for a Roman emperor. This reliance on foreign powers created a deep and bitter division within Byzantine society itself, pitting those who saw submission to the Latin West as the only path to survival against those who viewed any compromise with the old enemy as a betrayal of their faith and identity. The empire's final century began not with a bang, but with this slow, agonizing erosion of everything that had once made it strong. Within the great palace of Constantinople, politics was a poison served in a golden cup. The very halls that had once echoed with proclamations of imperial power now hummed with the whispers of conspirators. The Palaiologan dynasty, the last family to hold the Byzantine throne, seemed trapped in a cycle of self-destruction, where the greatest threat to an emperor often came from his own bloodline. Rival cousins, uncles, and brothers constantly vied for the crown, while powerful aristocratic families and even the empress mother would form shifting alliances to control a weak ruler or a child emperor. This created an atmosphere of intense paranoia, where trust was the most expensive currency and betrayal was a standard tool of statecraft. These were not simple family squabbles. They were civil wars in waiting, and when they erupted, they bled the empire dry. Precious gold that should have paid for soldiers to guard the frontiers was instead spent on mercenaries to fight fellow Byzantines. Armies that should have been facing the Ottoman advance were instead turned inward, tearing apart the few provinces the empire had left. Sometimes, these rival factions would even invite foreign powers like the Serbs or the Turks to intervene on their behalf, a desperate gamble that strengthened their internal position while weakening the empire as a whole. The chronicler Doukas saw this tragedy unfold, writing that the Romans were their own worst enemies. It was a stark admission that the final barrier to survival was not just the enemy at the gate, but the enemy within the palace walls. How could a state possibly present a united front against a rising power when its own leadership was so deeply fractured? This internal decay set the stage for a confrontation that would force the empire to make a fateful and deeply controversial choice. This desperate search for allies forced the Byzantine emperors onto a diplomatic tightrope stretched across the entire Mediterranean. Their most logical and most problematic potential saviors were the powerful city-states of Italy, particularly Venice and Genoa. These maritime republics possessed the fleets and the finances that Constantinople so desperately lacked, yet every agreement signed with them came at a steep price. In exchange for naval support or loans, the Byzantines were often forced to grant these Italian merchants extraordinary trade privileges within their own empire. Soon, the bustling ports of the Aegean were dominated by Genoese and Venetian traders, who paid little to no tax, undercutting local Byzantine merchants and siphoning wealth directly out of the empire. The emperors were essentially trading their economic future for a few more years of political survival, watching their own commercial lifeblood drain away to feed their so-called allies. Even more divisive were the repeated appeals to the Pope and the kingdoms of Western Europe for a new crusade. The emperors hoped to channel the military fervor of the West against their common Ottoman foe. But the papacy and Western monarchs had a condition that tore at the very soul of the Byzantine state. They demanded that the Orthodox Church, which had been separate from Rome for centuries, submit to the authority of the Pope. For many Byzantine citizens and clergy, this was an unthinkable betrayal of their faith and identity. They would rather see the Turk in the city than the Latin mitre in their cathedrals. This created a bitter internal schism, pitting those who saw religious union as a necessary political evil against those who viewed it as a spiritual surrender. An emperor might secure a promise of military aid from the West, only to return to Constantinople and face riots and rejection from his own people, making the promised aid useless. The most heartbreaking betrayals, however, were not international but familial. The empire's internal power struggles constantly leaked beyond its borders, inviting foreign manipulation. A disgruntled cousin or a power-hungry general would secretly approach the Serbian king, or, most dangerously, the Ottoman Sultan himself, offering loyalty or territory in exchange for support in overthrowing the reigning emperor in Constantinople. In one devastating instance, Emperor John VII, in a bid for power, actually became a vassal to the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid and even fought alongside the Ottoman army against other Christian forces. This was the ultimate paradox of the empire's final century. To win a civil war, a Byzantine contender would strengthen the very power that was destined to destroy them all. Each of these desperate diplomatic gambits, whether with Italian bankers, Western kings, or Ottoman sultans, unraveled the empire's sovereignty thread by thread. How could a state maintain its independence when its survival depended on constantly bargaining away pieces of itself? This relentless external pressure would soon force the empire to make its most controversial and defining gamble of all. While the emperor sat upon the golden throne, true power often resided in the shadows just beyond it. The final decades of Byzantium were shaped not only by its crowned rulers, but by a handful of immensely powerful individuals who controlled the levers of the state from behind the scenes. These were the shadow emperors, men like the Megas Du or Grand Duke Laucus Notaras. As the empire's leading admiral and one of its wealthiest aristocrats, Notaras commanded the pathetic remnants of the navy and held the keys to a treasury that was more symbolic than substantial. His voice in the imperial council often carried more weight than that of the emperor himself, and his personal ambitions, his deep-seated rivalries, and his staunch opposition to any union with the Roman Catholic Church would critically influence the empire's final, desperate choices. Across the Golden Horn in the fortified Genos colony of Galata, another shadow emperor held court. The Genos Podestar, or governor, was a merchant prince whose loyalty lay not with Constantinople, but with the profit and power of Genoa. He controlled the strategic Bosporus Strait and commanded a fleet that could, and often did, blockade the Byzantine capital on a whim. The Podestar's influence was so profound that Byzantine emperors had to negotiate with him as if he were a foreign head of state, begging for grain, for naval support, or simply for a promise of non-aggression. These powerful figures created a fractured and paralyzed government. An emperor might decide on a course of action, only to have it undermined by his own Grand Duke, who controlled the funds and the ships, or rendered impossible by the Genos Podestar, who controlled the sea lanes. They manipulated foreign policy, arranging diplomatic marriages to secure their own families' standing rather than the empire's security. They amassed vast private armies, hoarding soldiers who should have been defending the frontiers. The chronicler George S. Francis, a loyal imperial servant, lamented this bitter reality, writing of councils where the true debate was not about what was best for the empire, but about which faction would benefit and which would lose. How can a state possibly act with decisiveness when its very heart is divided against itself? This internal conflict, this silent war between the visible ruler and the hidden powers, created a vacuum of leadership at the worst possible moment. It was into this void of indecision that the empire's most formidable adversary would step, with a clarity of purpose that Byzantium could no longer muster. While the Byzantine court was paralyzed by internal squabbles, a new power was rising with terrifying speed and unity of purpose. Across the Bosporus, the Ottoman state was not merely growing, it was fundamentally reshaping the political landscape. Under the brilliant and ruthless leadership of Sultan Murad I, what began as a small Turkish principality exploded into a transcontinental empire. Murad perfected a system of military and administrative organization that made the Ottomans an unstoppable force. He established the corps of the famed Janissary Corps, an elite infantry that would become the terror of European battlefields. But it was his son, Bayezid I, who truly revealed the scope of the Ottoman ambition. Known as Yildirim, or the Thunderbolt, for the incredible speed of his military campaigns, Bayezid dedicated his reign to the complete encirclement of Constantinople. He understood that the great city could not be taken by a simple frontal assault. It had to be suffocated. His armies swept through the Balkans, subjugating Bulgarian and Serbian kingdoms that had once been Byzantine rivals, but were now the empire's last potential buffers. With each victory, another route for men and grain to reach Constantinople was severed. The Ottoman state was like a master chess player, patiently moving its pieces to trap the enemy king. Their strategic position was a nightmare for the Byzantines, straddling both Asia and Europe. This allowed them to attack from two directions at once, forcing the dwindling imperial armies to split their already meager forces. How do you defend a city when the enemy controls both shores of the waterway that feeds it? The Ottomans did not just conquer land, they mastered the art of assimilation. One of their most effective and feared institutions was the Devshirme, often called the blood tax. This was the systematic conscription of young Christian boys from conquered Balkan villages. These children were taken from their families, raised as Muslims, and subjected to years of rigorous military and academic training. The most gifted among them would ascend to become janissaries, the Sultan's personal slave soldiers, utterly loyal only to him. This practice was devastatingly clever. It simultaneously deprived conquered peoples of their strongest potential future leaders, while fueling the Ottoman war machine with its most disciplined troops. The Byzantine Empire, with its fractious aristocrats and unreliable mercenaries, had no answer for such a dedicated and professional military force. The contrast could not have been starker. On one side, a dynamic, centralized state with a clear vision for the future. On the other, a fractured, bankrupt empire trapped in the ghosts of its own past. The Thunderbolts campaigns made it clear that the question was no longer if Constantinople would fall, but when. This looming confrontation would force the Byzantines to make a final, desperate gamble, one that would tear their society apart in a last bid for salvation. The Maritza River ran red on a September day in 1371. A massive Serbian army, joined by Byzantine contingents, marched with confidence into Ottoman territory, intent on crushing the rising Turkish power. They never expected the blow that fell upon them in the dead of night. Ottoman light cavalry launched a devastating surprise attack on the Allied camp, turning the riverbanks into a scene of utter chaos and slaughter. The Christian army was annihilated. Serbian King Vukašin and his co-ruler perished, and with them died the dream of a powerful Serbian state that could stand as a bulwark for Byzantium. The Battle of Maritza was not just a defeat, it was a political earthquake. The Serbian Empire, once a formidable rival to Constantinople, fractured into a collection of squabbling principalities, each soon forced to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. For the Byzantine Empire, the loss was catastrophic. The Serbian shield was shattered. The empire's few remaining European provinces were now laid bare, with the great city of Thessalonica, the second city of the empire, suddenly appearing on the front line. The Ottomans did not just win a battle that day, they won the entire southern Balkans. How could a single night's fighting so completely reshape the map of an entire continent? The answer lies in the new style of warfare the Ottomans had mastered. They employed swift, mobile forces that could strike where and when they were least expected, a stark contrast to the slow, heavily armored knights of the Christian armies. The shockwave from Maritza was felt from the Danube to the walls of Constantinople itself. It was a brutal announcement that a new order was being forged, and that the old empires of the region were no longer the masters of their own fate. With the Serbian buffer gone, the Byzantine emperors were left staring at a horizon filled with nothing but Ottoman banners, forcing them to contemplate a desperate and humiliating new strategy for survival. Thessaloniki was not just a city, it was a living memory. For years on end, this second capital of the empire endured a torment that was as much about starvation as it was about steel. Its agony was not a single event but a long, drawn-out siege that stretched across decades, a slow bleeding of hope that showcased the Byzantine government's paralysis. The city became a tragic pawn in a much larger and more desperate game. In a move that stunned its own citizens, the Byzantine regents actually sold Thessaloniki to the Republic of Venice, hoping the powerful Italian navy could defend what they could not. This was not a true alliance but an admission of absolute weakness, a trading of sovereignty for a fleeting promise of security. The city was later reclaimed, then lost again, its fate swinging wildly with every shift in imperial policy and every empty promise of foreign aid. How do you maintain the will to fight when your own government treats your home as a piece of currency? The final Ottoman conquest in 1430 was a massacre. It was a brutal, definitive end to the long struggle, but the true loss was deeper than the military defeat. Thessaloniki had been a beacon of Hellenic culture and Orthodox faith for over 1,000 years, a vital nerve center connecting Constantinople to the wider Greek world. Its libraries, its churches, its very streets were a direct link to the classical past that the empire claimed to embody. When the city fell, that link was severed forever. The empire was not just losing territory, it was losing its identity piece by piece. The capture of Thessaloniki sent a chilling message to every remaining Byzantine subject. If a city of such immense size and historical importance could not be saved, then no city was safe. Constantinople was now utterly alone, a solitary island of imperial purple in a rising green sea of Ottoman dominion, its fate seeming less a matter of if but when. A final, brilliant hope flickered to life in 1444. For the first time in decades, a truly formidable Crusader army was on the march, its banners bearing the crosses of Hungary and Poland, its treasury filled with papal gold. Led by the young and charismatic King Ladislaw Roman III, this force represented the culmination of years of desperate Byzantine diplomacy. It was the empire's last, best chance to shatter the Ottoman vice gripping Constantinople. Emperor John VIII had staked everything on this single throw of the dice, promising the religious union with Rome that his people so despised in exchange for this military deliverance. As the Crusaders marched southward, they carried not just weapons, but the entire weight of a 1,000-year-old empire's final prayer. The strategic aim was audacious: to drive the Ottoman armies from Europe and restore a secure frontier for the Byzantines. For a few glorious months, it seemed the tide of history might actually be turning. Then came the plains of Varna. The Crusader army, confident and seeking a decisive engagement, met the Ottoman forces led by Sultan Murad II. The battle was a brutal, day-long affair of shifting fortunes. The Christian knights fought with incredible valor, initially breaking through the Ottoman lines. But in a moment of fatal, impulsive courage, King Ladislaw led a direct cavalry charge against the very center of the Ottoman army, aiming for the Sultan himself. His horse was cut down and the young king was killed on the spot. With their leader fallen, the Crusader army's cohesion shattered. The battle became a rout, a slaughter that stained the Black Sea coast with the blood of Europe's finest knights. The sound of celebration in Constantinople turned to one of mourning. The news of the defeat at Varna was more than a military setback. It was the closing of a door. The massive investment of political capital, the bitter compromise of faith, all of it had been for nothing. The defeat extinguished the final, realistic hope for a military rescue from Christian Europe. No other king or pope would ever again muster such a force for the sake of a dying empire. Emperor John VIII was left utterly isolated, his authority broken and his treasury empty, staring across the Bosporus at a sultan who was now more determined and vengeful than ever. The Crusade of Varna was the empire's last gasp. Its failure meant that from that day forward, the fall of Constantinople was not a possibility, but an inevitability. The only question that remained was how long the ancient walls could hold against the final, gathering storm. He wore the crown of Constantine, yet his most powerful weapon was his pen. Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos ascended the throne in 1391, inheriting a realm that was little more than the city of Constantinople itself, plus a few scattered outposts. He was a scholar, a theologian who wrote elegant dialogues on logic and faith, a man who would have been more at home in a university than on a battlefield. His reign presents one of history's great tragic portraits, the philosopher king forced to become a full-time beggar. He spent years traveling across Western Europe, from London to Paris, kneeling before kings and pleading for soldiers and ships. Imagine the spectacle, the heir to the Roman Empire, reduced to a supplicant in foreign courts, his dignity the price for a few more years of survival. His intellectual brilliance was undeniable, but it was a tool of little use against the grim arithmetic of Ottoman power. He was forced to become a vassal to the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, required to provide troops for the very army that sought to extinguish his empire. This was the ultimate humiliation, a concession that bought time but cost the empire its last shred of sovereign pride. Then a miracle seemed to occur. The thunderous armies of the Turkic conqueror Timur crashed into the Ottomans at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, shattering Bayezid's forces and taking the Sultan himself prisoner. The Ottoman state was plunged into a bitter civil war between Bayezid's sons, a 20-year interregnum of chaos that was Manuel's greatest and only real opportunity. Here his diplomatic genius shone. He skillfully played the rival Ottoman princes against one another, supporting first one, then another, in a delicate dance designed to keep them divided and weak. He even managed to reclaim the city of Thessalonica and some territories along the Black Sea coast. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed the relentless Ottoman advance had been permanently halted. But what could a philosopher king truly build on such a foundation of shifting sand? His diplomatic victories were fleeting. The empire was too poor, its population too small, its spirit too broken to capitalize on the Ottoman crisis in any lasting way. He could not raise a new Roman army, only manipulate the armies of others. When the Ottoman civil war finally ended and a new, determined sultan emerged, all of Manuel's carefully negotiated gains evaporated. The territories were lost once more, and the vassalage was reimposed, this time even more tightly. Manuel's long reign was a masterclass in staving off the inevitable, a demonstration that intelligence and culture alone could not save a state whose material and human resources were exhausted. He died in 1425, having preserved the empire for nearly 35 years, but he left to his son an inheritance of hollow titles and impossible choices. His life was the empire's final, poignant paradox, a testament to the power of the human spirit in the face of an unstoppable tide. The ink was barely dry on the decree of union when the backlash began to boil. In the Grand Basilica of Santa Maria del Fiore, Emperor John VIII stood beside the Pope of Rome in 1439, signing a document meant to save his empire. The Council of Florence was the culmination of years of frantic diplomacy, a theological summit where Byzantine scholars and Catholic cardinals had debated for months over the finest points of doctrine. The emperor had achieved his primary goal, a formal proclamation that the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches were one again. In exchange, he was promised a massive crusade, a final army to push the Ottomans back and secure Constantinople's future. It was the ultimate political calculation, trading theological purity for the swords and ships of the West. Yet this desperate gamble ignored a fundamental truth, that for the average citizen of Constantinople, faith was not a bargaining chip. It was the very bedrock of their identity, the one thing that had remained constant through centuries of decline. The union was seen not as a necessary compromise, but as a wholesale surrender of their souls. How could they accept the authority of a pope whose followers had, centuries earlier, sacked their own city? The return of the imperial delegation to Constantinople was not a triumph, it was a public relations disaster. The monk and philosopher George Scholarios, who would later become the Patriarch Gennadios, emerged as the fiery voice of opposition. He did not merely disagree with the union, he denounced it from the pulpits as a heresy, a betrayal of the true faith for 30 pieces of silver. He tore the official decree of union to pieces in a public act of defiance that electrified the city. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the spiritual heart of the empire, became a battleground. Many clergy and laity refused to set foot inside it as long as the names of the Pope and the Unionist Emperor were commemorated during the liturgy. They gathered instead in smaller, fervently anti-Union churches, creating a shadow religious structure that held more popular support than the official one. This was more than a theological dispute, it was a civil war of the spirit. The empire fractured at the very moment it needed unity most. The emperor, who was supposed to be God's vicegerent on earth, was now viewed by a large portion of his people as a spiritual traitor. His authority, already weakened by empty coffers and shrinking borders, was irreparably broken. The promised crusade did eventually materialize, but its destruction at the Battle of Varna made the entire agonizing compromise seem tragically pointless. The Union of Florence left the empire not with a powerful ally, but with a deeply divided and demoralized populace, a fifth column of despair right inside the city walls. When the final siege came, this internal rift would mean that not every soul within Constantinople was truly fighting for the same cause, or even praying to the same God. For over 1,000 years, the sheer presence of these walls had been enough to make armies turn back. The Theodosian walls were not a simple barrier but a sprawling, multi-layered masterpiece of defensive engineering. Imagine 3 consecutive lines of fortifications stretching for 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. The first line was a deep, wide moat that could be flooded. Behind it rose a low outer wall followed by a large terrace, and then the massive inner wall, towering 40 feet high and 16 feet thick, studded with nearly 100 formidable towers. This system forced any attacker to fight through 3 separate killing zones, all while being pelted with arrows, rocks, and Greek fire from above. It was the most formidable land fortification in the known world, a physical manifestation of the empire's resilience. Yet by the 15th century, this great strength had become a profound liability. The empire could no longer afford its own primary defense. The cost of maintaining 4 miles of stonework was staggering. Emperors like John VIII and Constantine XI became permanent custodians, endlessly organizing repairs, patching sections damaged by earthquakes, and desperately trying to clear the choked moats. But the real crisis was manpower. Who would stand on those towering ramparts? The population of Constantinople had shrunk so dramatically that there were simply not enough Byzantine soldiers to hold the line. Gaps were filled with a motley collection of hired swords, Venetian sailors, and Genoese adventurers whose loyalty was as thin as the coins that paid them. This created a dangerous paradox. The very legend of the wall's impregnability bred a fragile sense of overconfidence. Generations had grown up believing the massive stones alone would save them, fostering a psychological dependence that masked the grim reality of their depleted garrisons. How do you defend a symbol when you lack the substance to make it real? The walls stood as a magnificent, crumbling monument to past glory, a shield that the empire could no longer properly hold, awaiting the one force determined enough and smart enough to find its one fatal weakness. The imperial treasury was not just empty, it had become a hollow echo chamber. At its economic peak, the Byzantine Empire drew wealth from provinces stretching from Italy to Syria, a vast network of farms, mines, and ports that fed a sophisticated and powerful state. By the final century, that network had been severed. The tax base had shrunk to a pitiful sliver of land around Constantinople itself, a city now crowded not with wealthy merchants but with refugees and empty monasteries. The lifeblood of trade, once controlled by Byzantine ships, now flowed exclusively through the hands of Italian merchants. The Venetians and Genoese occupied entire quarters of the capital, operating from their own fortified docks, paying minimal duties and funneling all the real profits back to their home cities. The empire was like a landlord who owned a grand house but had rented out all the profitable rooms, leaving himself destitute in his own crumbling foyer. This financial collapse had a tangible symbol you could hold in your hand, the hyperpyron. This gold coin was once the dollar of the medieval world, renowned for its purity and stability, trusted from Scandinavia to Egypt. But as crisis followed crisis, the emperors began to secretly mix more and more base metals into the gold. Each new coin that entered circulation was a little lighter, a little less brilliant, a silent announcement that the state was broke. What happens when the very money you use every day loses its value? Prices for grain and oil skyrocketed, savings evaporated, and economic confidence simply vanished. The government was actively destroying the foundation of its own economy in a desperate attempt to pay for tomorrow's bread. The final indignities were stark and deeply symbolic. The crown jewels, the physical manifestations of imperial glory, were shipped off to Venice and placed in a pawnbroker's vault as collateral for a loan that was never fully repaid. The great palace of the emperors, a sprawling complex of marble halls and gilded chambers that had hosted 1,000 years of court ritual, was slowly abandoned. Its roofs leaked, its mosaics cracked, and its gardens grew wild. The emperor and his court retreated to the more modest Blasciani Palace in the city's northwest corner, a move that spoke volumes about their shrunken circumstances. How do you project power and majesty when you cannot even afford to maintain your own home? This utter impoverishment dictated every single military decision. A standing army of professional, loyal soldiers was a fantasy from a bygone era. The imperial navy, which had once commanded the Mediterranean, was reduced to a handful of dilapidated galleys, utterly outclassed by the fleets of Genoa and Venice anchored just across the Golden Horn. To put any men on the legendary walls or any ships in the water, the emperor had to beg, borrow, or hire. He became a manager of mercenaries, a negotiator of loans, always one missed payment away from being completely defenseless. This economic strangulation was a slower, quieter siege than any army could lay, but it was just as fatal. It ensured that when the final storm arrived, the empire would face it not only with divided spirits, but with empty hands. His coronation was a quiet affair, held far from the ancient capital. In the Peloponnesian city of Mistras, Constantine XI Palaiologos was crowned in 1449, a ceremony devoid of the traditional pomp of Constantinople. This geographical shift was more than mere convenience. It was a stark admission that the empire's true center of gravity had shifted, that the heart of Roman power now beat feebly in a provincial fortress. He inherited a title that echoed with 1,000 years of history, yet his actual domain was a cruel joke. Constantinople itself was a ghostly metropolis, its vast neighborhoods lying empty within the mighty walls, its population dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls. Beyond the city, he controlled a small slice of the Peloponnese and a few islands, territories constantly threatened by his own ambitious brothers and Ottoman raiders. He was an emperor without an empire, a king whose castle was his entire kingdom. How does a leader prepare for the end of the world? For Constantine, the answer was a relentless, grinding, and ultimately heartbreaking effort. His entire reign was a single, sustained preparation for a siege he knew was coming. He spent his few precious years in a state of perpetual emergency, writing desperate letters to every corner of Christendom, from the Pope to the Doge of Venice, begging for men, for weapons, for grain. He personally oversaw the frantic repairs to the Theodosian walls, patching the crumbling mortar with his own hands, a monarch-turned-master mason. He was a brave and resolute man by all accounts, but his courage was pitted against an impossible tide. He was like a captain desperately bailing water from a ship that was already half submerged, knowing the ocean would claim it sooner or later. He was a prisoner of his birth, chained to a throne that was itself a monument to loss, destined to be the final custodian of a legacy he could not save. His personal tragedy was that he was competent, dedicated, and clear-eyed about his fate, forced to preside over the last act of a play that had been written centuries before he ever took the stage. Across the Bosporus, a new sultan studied the same ancient walls, but he saw not an immovable barrier, only a complex problem awaiting its solution. Sultan Mehmed II was just 19 years old when he took the Ottoman throne, a young man consumed by a single, burning ambition to succeed where all his ancestors had failed. He was not merely a warrior, he was a scholar fluent in several languages, an admirer of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and a ruler who saw the capture of Constantinople as his divine and historical destiny. He believed himself to be the true heir to the Roman Caesars, destined to unite the classical world under his banner. This intellectual and ruthless young man would prove to be the architect of the Byzantine Empire's final hour. His first move was a masterstroke of psychological and military intimidation. He ordered the construction of a massive fortress, Rumeli Hisari, directly on the European shore of the Bosporus, opposite an older Ottoman fort on the Asian side. This was not just a castle, it was a stranglehold. Its great cannons could now control all ship traffic to and from Constantinople, intercepting the grain ships from the Black Sea that were the city's lifeline. The message was terrifyingly clear. Mehmed could starve the great city into submission without even launching a single ship. While Emperor Constantine was writing letters and patching walls, Mehmed was assembling the most advanced military machine of the age. He sought out the best cannon founder he could find, a Hungarian named Orban, and gave him limitless resources to build a weapon that could shatter legend. The result was a monstrous bombard, so large it had to be transported by dozens of oxen and hundreds of men. This cannon could fire a stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds, a projectile with enough force to crumble the Theodosian walls that had stood for a millennium. How do you fight an enemy who is not only stronger but smarter, and who is actively reinventing the rules of warfare? Mehmed's army was a spectacle of terrifying diversity and discipline. At its core were the Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers raised from childhood for war, utterly loyal and unbreakable in battle. They were supported by tens of thousands of skilled Sipahi cavalry, and by vast irregular forces of Bashi Bazauks, fierce warriors who fought for plunder. He even had a navy built from scratch to challenge the Italian dominance of the seas. Every resource of his burgeoning empire was funneled into this single, all-consuming goal. The contrast with the Byzantine defense could not have been more absolute. On one side, a unified, well-funded, and technologically superior force led by a brilliant and determined young commander. On the other, a divided, impoverished, and demoralized city, its fate resting on the shoulders of a brave but hopelessly outmatched emperor. Mehmed's unwavering vision made the coming conflict feel less like a war and more like an execution. The final act was about to begin, and the stage was set not for a battle, but for a siege that would echo through history. The sound that would end an era was not the clash of swords, but the deafening roar of bronze. Sultan Mehmed II had found his master key to the ancient walls, a Hungarian engineer named Orban. This man had initially offered his services to the Byzantines, but Emperor Constantine's empty treasury could not meet his price. So Orban took his genius across the Bosporus to the one ruler who could fund his apocalyptic vision. The result was a monster of metal, a bombard so colossal it took dozens of oxen and hundreds of soldiers weeks to drag it into position before the city. Its stone cannonballs weighed as much as a small carriage. When it fired, the thunderous blast was said to terrify pregnant women and could be heard miles away, a declaration of a new age of warfare. For over 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls had stood firm against rams, towers, and mining, but they were masonry designed to withstand the steady pressure of men, not the concentrated, brute force of a 1,200-pound stone projectile fired again and again at the same spot. The walls began to crumble. Each impact was a seismic shock, sending clouds of dust and shattered brick into the air, systematically undoing a millennium of defensive confidence. The Byzantines had a handful of their own cannons, but they were smaller, less reliable, and their gunners lacked the relentless, practiced discipline of the Ottoman crews. More dangerously, one of their largest guns exploded during a test firing, killing several defenders and damaging the morale of everyone on the ramparts. How do you fight an enemy who can break your strongest shield from a distance? The very definition of safety was being rewritten before their eyes. The Ottoman artillery did not just punch holes in stone, it shattered a fundamental psychological truth. The legendary invincibility of Constantinople's defenses, the core of the empire's identity for centuries, was evaporating into the smoke-filled air. Every boom of the great cannon was a countdown, a grim reminder that time itself was now the empire's most precious and dwindling resource. The first Ottoman sentries appeared on the horizon in early April of 1453. What began as a dust cloud soon became an endless river of men, horses, and artillery, flowing toward the ancient walls until the very landscape seemed to move. Within days, the city of Constantine was completely encircled, a lone island in a sea of enemy tents and banners. Sultan Mehmed had drawn his noose tight, but his most audacious maneuver was yet to come. The great chain across the Golden Horn, the massive iron boom that protected the city's vulnerable northern harbor, had rendered his fleet useless, or so the defenders believed. In a stunning feat of military engineering, the Sultan ordered his crews to haul dozens of warships on greased wooden rollers over the hill behind Galata, bypassing the chain entirely. One morning, the citizens of Constantinople woke to find the Golden Horn, their sheltered inner harbor, filled with Ottoman sails. The city was now besieged from every direction, its last safe avenue for supply and reinforcement suddenly gone. Inside the walls, the atmosphere was thick with dread and defiance. Emperor Constantine and his trusted Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, had fewer than 7,000 men to hold a perimeter that required 20,000. They were school teachers and merchants standing alongside professional Venetian sailors and Genoese mercenaries, a thin line of hope against an Ottoman host numbering over 80,000. In a desperate attempt to bolster morale, the emperor ordered the most sacred relic in the city, the holy icon of the Virgin Hodegetria, to be paraded along the battlements. The solemn procession wound through the streets with priests, nuns, and citizens joining in hymns and prayers, begging for divine intervention. It was a powerful, heartbreaking spectacle, a fusion of faith and fatalism. They were no longer fighting just for an empire, but for their very souls and the sanctity of their altars. Every person, from the emperor to the lowest beggar, understood that this was a fight to the death, a final, terrible stand for a world that was about to vanish forever. For weeks, the great iron chain held, stretched taut across the entrance to the Golden Horn. This floating boom of massive wooden logs linked by heavy iron links was a marvel of medieval engineering. It protected the city's vulnerable northern seawalls and the small fleet of Christian galleys, mostly Venetian and Genoese, that sheltered in the harbor. From their decks, sailors could look out and see the main Ottoman fleet anchored uselessly beyond the chain, unable to force a passage. This naval stalemate was the one bright spot for the defenders, a small pocket of security in a siege defined by relentless pressure. It proved that Byzantine and Italian seamanship could still hold its own against overwhelming numbers, but Sultan Mehmed was not a man who accepted stalemates. He watched the chain from a hilltop, his strategic mind already working on a solution that defied conventional warfare. He would not break the chain. He would simply go around it. The plan was as brilliant as it was audacious. He ordered the construction of a wooden road, a greased track of logs laid across the hill behind the neutral Genos colony of Pera. Under the cover of darkness, teams of oxen and thousands of men began the Herculean task of hauling dozens of his lighter warships straight out of the water, up the steep slope, and down the other side into the far end of the Golden Horn. The creak of ropes and the grunts of laborers filled the night, a secret operation of staggering scale. When dawn broke on that late April morning, the defenders on the walls stared in stunned disbelief. The impossible had happened. The inner harbor, their sanctuary, was now dotted with Ottoman warships. How do you fight an enemy who can move fleets over mountains? The psychological blow was devastating. The one place they had felt safe was suddenly a new front line. Emperor Constantine was forced to make a desperate and costly decision. He ordered a night attack by his best Christian ships, a bold attempt to burn this new Ottoman fleet where it lay. The assault was initially successful, with Greek fire lighting up the darkness and causing panic. But Mehmed had anticipated this. He had positioned powerful artillery on the shore, and as the Christian galleys pressed their attack, a storm of cannon fire and arrows rained down upon them. The element of surprise was lost, and the counterattack was driven back with heavy losses. This failed gamble cost the defenders precious men and ships they could not replace. Now, the already stretched Byzantine soldiers had to man an entirely new section of the city's northern walls, watching the water behind them. The siege was no longer just at the land walls, it was everywhere at once. The naval struggle had been a battle of wits, and Mehmed's breathtaking innovation had shattered the last illusion of security, pulling the noose around Constantinople tighter than anyone had thought possible. Inside the city, a profound and somber silence fell, broken only by the chanting of priests. On the evening of May 28, 1453, the great dome of the Hagia Sophia echoed with hymns for the last time. Emperor Constantine, his generals, the Venetian and Genos mercenaries, and the ordinary citizens who had endured the siege all gathered as one. They stood shoulder to shoulder, aristocrat and beggar, setting aside the bitter divisions over church union and class that had fractured their society. In this final, unified act, they received communion together, not as subjects of a dying empire, but as souls preparing to meet their God. It was a moment of heartbreaking beauty, a last flicker of light in the gathering darkness. The emperor then moved among his commanders and the weary soldiers stationed along the walls. His final speech was not a call to save a throne, but a plea to defend everything they held sacred. He spoke of their duty to their faith, to the memory of their ancestors, and to the honor of the Christian name. He asked them to be brave, reminding them that the eyes of all history were upon them. Across the field, the Ottoman camp was a spectacle of fire and noise, a stark contrast to the quiet devotion inside the city. Thousands of lamps and torches lit the night, illuminating the final preparations of an army confident of victory. Sultan Mehmed had promised his soldiers the legendary plunder of Constantinople, and the anticipation of riches fueled a frenetic energy. The sounds of hammers, marching feet, and shouted orders created a dissonant symphony of imminent violence. This was the last night of the Roman Empire, a civilization that had endured for more than 11 centuries. For the men and women inside the walls, it was a vigil, a long goodbye to a world they knew would be gone by morning. The final Ottoman assault began in the dead of night. a relentless wave of attacks designed to exhaust the last reserves of the defenders' strength. For hours, the soldiers on the walls fought back the Sultan's irregular troops, the Bashi Bazauks, and then his more disciplined Anatolian soldiers. Just before dawn, as the defenders' arms grew heavy with fatigue, Sultan Mehmed committed his ultimate weapon, the elite Janissaries. These highly trained warriors advanced with terrifying discipline, their approach accompanied by the deafening beat of drums and cymbals. They pressed forward against a hail of stones and arrows, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach the damaged outer walls. The defense hinged on one man, the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, who stood like a rock at the most vulnerable point, the St. Romanus Gate. His presence had been the glue holding the diverse bands of defenders together. Then, a devastating blow. Giustiniani was struck down, severely wounded by a lead ball from an arquebus or perhaps a shard of cannon shot. The injury was catastrophic, and his men, seeing their leader fall, carried him from the ramparts in a desperate attempt to save his life. His evacuation from the front line was a catastrophe in itself. The Genoese mercenaries, who formed the backbone of that sector, believed the battle was lost. Panic spread through the ranks faster than any fire. At that exact moment of chaos, a small but fatal error was exploited. A postern gate, the Kerkeporta, had either been left open after a local counterattack or was forced open from the outside. A group of Ottoman soldiers surged through this tiny opening, planting their banner on a tower inside the outer wall and raising a triumphant cry. The combination was lethal. With Giustiniani gone and the enemy suddenly inside their perimeter, the defense collapsed at its most critical point. The Janissaries, seeing the confusion, redoubled their efforts and poured through the breach. The orderly line of battle dissolved in an instant. The fight for Constantinople was no longer a siege. It had become a massacre in the making, spilling from the broken walls into the narrow, winding streets of the ancient city. The emperor's final moments are shrouded in the fog of a dying city. As the Ottoman tide poured through the shattered gates, Constantine XI made his choice. He would not flee, nor would he be paraded in chains as a captive sultan's trophy. The legends say he tore off his imperial purple regalia, the symbols of an office that was about to vanish from the earth. Clad now as a common soldier, he drew his sword and charged directly into the heart of the chaos, vanishing into the swirling mass of janissaries and crumbling stone. He died fighting anonymously, a final, desperate act of solidarity with the empire he had failed to save. In the aftermath, amidst the carnage and the systematic looting, his body was never formally identified. The Ottomans searched, wanting confirmation of their ultimate victory, but the last Roman emperor had simply disappeared. This absence of a corpse gave birth to one of history's most poignant myths. A story spread among the shattered Greek population that their emperor was not truly dead. They whispered that angels had snatched him away at the final instant, turning him into a marble statue that now slept hidden beneath the city, perhaps near the Golden Gate. There he would wait, a king in stone, until the day God called him to awaken, to rise and drive the conquerors from Constantinople and restore the empire to its former glory. This powerful legend, the legend of the Marble Emperor, served a profound purpose for a people entering centuries of subjugation. It transformed a military defeat into a story of suspended hope. Constantine was no longer just a failed ruler. He was a messianic figure, a symbol of eventual redemption. His anonymous death allowed his memory to become whatever his people needed it to be, a perpetual promise of liberation. Whether the historical account is perfectly accurate is almost irrelevant. The narrative that took root cemented his status as the ultimate tragic hero of Greek folklore, a noble king who chose to share the fate of his humblest subject. With his death, an unbroken line of Roman emperors that stretched back nearly 1,500 years to Augustus Caesar was extinguished forever. He became a symbol of resistance and martyrdom, a figure whose imagined return gave generations the strength to endure. His story is not merely about how an empire fell, but about how its memory was forged into a weapon for the soul, a timeless echo of what was lost and what, in the hearts of his people, might one day be restored. For 3 days, the city endured a storm of destruction. The Ottoman soldiers, granted the ancient right of plunder, swept through the streets in a frenzy. They smashed their way into palaces and humble homes alike, tearing gold and jewels from altars and rounding up tens of thousands of terrified citizens to be sold into slavery. The great church of the Holy Wisdom, the Hagia Sophia, became the ultimate symbol of this conquest. Its sacred rites were silenced, its ancient Christian mosaics plastered over with whitewash, and its echoing spaces filled with the new sound of Islamic prayers. This was more than a military victory. It was a spiritual and cultural cataclysm. Priceless repositories of ancient knowledge were consumed by fire, their scrolls and codices feeding bonfires in the public squares. Statues from antiquity were melted down for their metal, and icons of saints were shattered. The accumulated treasure of a millennium was systematically dismantled and carried away. Yet amidst this calculated chaos, the conqueror himself saw a different future. Sultan Mehmed II understood that a ruined city was of no use to him. After the traditional 3 days of plunder, he immediately imposed strict order, halting the violence and sending his personal guards to protect key public buildings and infrastructure. He had not sought to erase Constantinople, but to possess it, to make it the glorious new capital of his own burgeoning empire. But for the kingdoms of Europe, the news was received with sheer horror. The fall of Constantinople was not just the loss of a city, it was the final, deafening crash of the Roman world. It felt as if a great library of human history had been set ablaze, its light extinguished forever. How does a civilization process the sudden, violent death of a 1,000-year-old idea? The dust had not yet settled when the conqueror began his work of reinvention. Mehmed II entered the conquered city not merely as a sultan, but as a man stepping into a legacy he deeply coveted. His first destination was the most symbolically charged space in all of Christendom, the great church of Hagia Sophia. He rode his horse directly into its vast, pillaged nave, a deliberate act to desecrate the site and claim it for Islam. Yet in the very next breath, he performed an act of breathtaking political and historical appropriation. He proclaimed himself Caesar Irum, Caesar of the Romans. This was no empty boast. By seizing this ancient title, Mehmed was audaciously declaring himself the legitimate heir to the very empire he had just destroyed. He was not erasing Roman history, he was claiming it as his own, stitching the mantle of Constantine and Justinian onto his Ottoman robes. How does a conqueror legitimize his rule over a people whose world he has shattered? He does it by convincing them he is not an outsider, but the next chapter in their own long story. His vision was not one of pure destruction, but of deliberate, pragmatic fusion. He understood that a ghost city was useless. To breathe life back into the empty streets, he initiated a massive resettlement policy, forcibly bringing in Muslim, Christian, and Jewish families from across his vast domain. Greeks and Armenians were encouraged to return, and he formally recognized their religious leaders, granting them a significant degree of autonomy to manage their own community affairs under the Ottoman system. This was the genesis of the millet system, a structure of religious self-governance that would define the empire for centuries. He was not just repopulating a capital, he was actively building a new, universal empire where Byzantine administrative savvy, Islamic law, and Turkic military tradition would blend into something entirely new. He even patronized Greek scholars, collected classical manuscripts, and had his own portrait painted by Italian artists. The city itself was given a new Turkish name, Istanbul, but its soul remained a complex mosaic of its past and present. This was the ultimate paradox of the fall. The man who ended the Roman Empire so violently immediately set about rebuilding its capital in his own image, ensuring that the echoes of Byzantium would resonate through the halls of power for generations to come. The echo of the last sword clash did not fade, it simply traveled. The world did not remain the same after the dust settled over Constantinople. This was far more than the destruction of a city. It was a fundamental rupture in the order of the known world, a true watershed that swept away the medieval era and forcefully ushered in the early modern age. Think of the old trade routes as vital arteries carrying the wealth of the East into the heart of Europe. Spices, silks, and precious gems flowed through markets in the Middle East up to Constantinople, and then into the hands of Venetian and Genoese merchants. With the Ottomans now firmly in control of this crucial crossroads, those arteries were severed. The old land routes became prohibitively expensive and dangerously unstable. Europe was suddenly cut off from the riches it craved, creating an urgent, desperate need for an alternative. This economic stranglehold became the single greatest catalyst for the age of exploration. If the land route was blocked, the answer was to find a sea route. Driven by this new imperative, the kingdoms on the Atlantic coast, Portugal and Spain, began sending their ships down the coast of Africa, and most famously, west across the uncharted ocean. The voyage of Columbus was not an isolated act of genius. It was a direct consequence of the Ottoman conquest. The search for a new path to the Indies inadvertently led to the discovery of the Americas, redrawing the entire map of the globe. But the city gave one final, priceless gift to the West even as it fell. The scholars who fled Constantinople, carrying precious, ancient manuscripts in their luggage, did not bring mere books. They brought back the intellectual heritage of classical Greece and Rome, works of philosophy, science, and literature that had been lost or forgotten in Western Europe for centuries. This sudden influx of knowledge acted like a lightning bolt to the Italian Renaissance. The works of Plato and Aristotle were studied with fresh eyes, inspiring a revolution in art, architecture, and thought that celebrated human potential and the physical world. The fall of one empire directly nourished the cultural rebirth of another. For the conquered Greek people and the wider Orthodox world, the loss of the city created a deep, spiritual wound that would never fully heal. It gave birth to the great idea, a powerful national dream of liberation and the eventual recapture of their ancient capital. This was not just a political goal, it was a sacred mission, a cultural obsession that would shape Greek identity and fuel nationalist movements in the Balkans for the next 400 years. Every Easter service in an Orthodox church would include a poignant prayer for the fallen city, keeping the memory of loss and the hope of return alive in every generation. Finally, the conquest cemented the Ottoman Empire not as a regional power, but as a world empire, a peer, and a permanent rival to the kingdoms of Europe. The centuries-long conflict between the Ottoman sultans and the Habsburg emperors, the great naval battles in the Mediterranean, the sieges of Vienna, all of this geopolitical tension finds its origin point in 1453. The fall of Constantinople did not just end an empire, it created a new world order, one whose boundaries, conflicts, and cultural exchanges were forged in the fires of that final, terrible siege. The fall of Constantinople sent a tremor through the very soul of Europe. a shockwave that artists and poets struggled to capture for generations. In the West, the news was met with a profound sense of guilt and horror, often depicted in grand, dramatic paintings showing the city in flames, its churches defiled, and its people led into chains. Pope Pius II wept and immediately began calling for a new crusade, a final effort to reclaim what was lost, but the kingdoms of Europe, divided by their own rivalries, could not muster the will. The event became a powerful cautionary tale in sermons and political writings, a stark reminder of the cost of Christian disunity in the face of a seemingly unstoppable foe. How do you process a loss that feels like the end of an era? For Western Christendom, the answer was to immortalize it in art and lamentation, turning the fall into a symbol of civilization itself under threat. For the conquered Greek people, the grief was not a distant political event but a raw, personal wound, processed not in palaces but in village squares and humble homes. Their pain found its voice in folk songs known as Marologia, haunting laments that passed the story of the fall from one generation to the next. These songs did not just recount history, they infused it with a deep spiritual longing. The legend of the marble emperor Constantine, asleep beneath the city, became a central pillar of this folk mythology. He was not dead, the songs promised, but merely enchanted, waiting for the angels to call him to wake up, reclaim his throne, and restore the world to its rightful order. This powerful narrative was more than a fairy tale. It was a psychological survival mechanism, transforming a crushing military defeat into a story of suspended hope and eventual redemption. The date, May 29, 1453, became a permanent scar on the calendar, a dividing line between a glorious past and a subjugated present. This shared memory of loss became the bedrock of a resilient cultural identity, a secret fire that kept the dream of liberation alive through 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. The event was so monumental that its shadow stretched far beyond the battlefield, shaping not just politics but the very stories people told about who they were and who they might one day become. Even today, that distant echo can still be heard, a reminder that the end of an empire is never just about the fall of a city, but about the birth of 1,000 stories that will outlive the stones. The fall of Constantinople was not a sudden collapse, but the final, dramatic breath of a patient dying from a long and complicated illness. We have traced the slow poison of internal conspiracies that turned the palace into a nest of vipers, the relentless wars that shrank the empire's borders to a shadow, and the profound economic and spiritual crises that left its treasury empty and its people divided. The empire did not fall in a day. It was dismantled piece by piece over a century of desperate gambles and fatal betrayals. Against this backdrop of inevitable decline, the heroic last stand of Constantine XI and his small band of defenders transcends mere military defeat. It becomes a timeless portrait of human courage, a conscious choice to face the end with dignity and resolve, even when hope itself had crumbled like the ancient walls around them. Their final hour was not about victory but about legacy, a defiant statement that some things are worth dying for. The echoes of that final siege did not fade into silence. They rippled outward, reshaping the entire world. The Ottoman control of the Bosporus severed the old land routes to the east, forcing European explorers onto the open ocean in a desperate search for new paths, a quest that accidentally unveiled the Americas and launched a new age of global connection. The Greek scholars who fled the fallen city with their precious manuscripts carried the intellectual seeds of classical learning directly into the heart of Italy, providing the kindling that set the Renaissance ablaze. The balance of power shifted irrevocably, setting the stage for centuries of conflict between East and West. This story is more than a chronicle of an empire's end. it is a mirror reflecting the cyclical nature of civilizations themselves. It asks us to consider what truly makes a society resilient, and how the choices of its leaders and its people can either delay or hasten an inevitable twilight. Let this epic tale of intrigue, war, and resilience inspire your own reflections on the forces that shape history. We would love to hear your thoughts on this monumental chapter in the comments below, and if you want to continue exploring the pivotal moments that forged our world, be sure to subscribe for our next journey. The stones of Constantinople did not simply endure, they were reborn under a new name. Sultan Mehmed saw himself not as a destroyer but as a restorer, and his vision for Istanbul was one of breathtaking renewal. He launched a monumental rebuilding program, constructing grand imperial mosques, covered markets that buzzed with commerce, and a new palace, Topkapi, that would serve as the administrative heart of his empire for centuries. Yet this was not a complete erasure of the past. Ottoman architects often incorporated spoiler, columns, and marble taken directly from Byzantine ruins, weaving the physical fabric of the old city into the bones of the new. The Grand Bazaar itself was built upon the site of an older Byzantine market, a direct continuation of the city's mercantile spirit under a new, vaulted roof. How does a conqueror build a lasting legacy? He does it by honoring the ground he walks on, even as he reshapes it. The most powerful symbol of this synthesis was, and remains, the Hagia Sophia. Its conversion into a mosque was an act of supreme political and religious significance, yet the structure itself was revered and preserved. The Christian mosaics depicting Christ and the emperors were not smashed, but carefully covered with whitewash and plaster, hiding them from view while protecting them for future generations. Minarets were added to its silhouette, not to diminish its form but to augment it, creating a new skyline that acknowledged both its past and its present. This was not a city that forgot what it had been. It was a city that learned to wear its history in layers. From the ashes of a fallen empire, a new, vibrant capital emerged, a phoenix that drew its strength from the very ruins it rose upon. This final transformation offers a profound reminder that while empires and dynasties are mortal, the great cities they build often possess a strange kind of immortality. They are not erased by conquest but redefined, their spirit enduring through countless reinventions, waiting patiently for the next chapter to be